is enough.
Yeah.
Okay, Voyce.
I was just referring to movements that changes the system. Always, if it changes in a way that affects financing and who's getting what in terms of income of it, it can be disrupted in very different ways, but you have to be conscious of it. For existence, I was talking about the PAC model of Wisconsin, which is the case management model, where you have people living in the community and case managers. They call they don't use case managers now. They use the term community specialists or something like that. But they essentially keep them out in their apartments, in their home. It's a way to not have them institutionalized.
Yeah.
When that first model started, the people behind it were minimal medications and the kind of language that we're talking about now. But,
and you said who were the people? You named two people.
Marianne Test. It was the Stein and Test studies of the 70s, which is I think the name of the studies. And essentially it was the University of Wisconsin, Madison. That's where it comes out of. And it really drove that model nationally. And after that, you start seeing states and start funding these kind of programs as part of the continuum of care in the mental health systems. And in order to do that, to be included, you have to accept the fact that what you're going to do is make sure when the people go out of the community, they stay on their medications.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're saying the original people who created the
they were by most of, if you look at it in the 70s, most of the professional people, a lot of them are not what we think of psychiatrists, psychologists. It just happened the PAC model was set up by two professionals, one psychologist and one psychiatrist. That's the sector. But the California social rehab model was much more residential. And a lot of those folks were not. In fact, probably the most powerful person in California, the social rehab model, was Steve Fields, the Progress Foundation in San Francisco. And the way he comes into the field is in, I guess it was late 60s. This is when the Vietnam War, people were going to Canada in order to not be drafted. He was one of these folks. And when he came back, went to court, and part of that process was he had to do community work for, I don't know, some amount of time. And what he did, it was set up a community of people who had been discharged from the hospital. He set up residential community. He started that model in San Francisco. And that he was very progressive. Minimal medication, more peer support and all. The language is that. So then you find all these residential programs sort of using that model statewide. And we formed a group called CASRA, California Association of Social Rehabilitation Agencies. It's a byproduct of international, the same title, but it starts with international. And that became the driving force of these type of programs in the state. And when we got together and Tom Bates was a congressman, we got him to sponsor a bill to create a funding source for these programs. And what came out of that was called the Bates Bill. And then what happened with that is all these programs suddenly had a funding source, and it became part of the continuum of care of the county hospital system. You know, you go when you left the hospital, you went to one type of residential care, and that legislation created the type of homes you see models of home, respite home, all that comes out of that legislation. And so what happens, that becomes a part of the traditional mental health system, the county system.
Yeah.
And when you do that, the expectations that certain treatments will happen and certain things like medication follow-up and all that stuff becomes a part of that system. So when these programs suddenly gets adapted, they suddenly take on a different tone.
Yeah.
Lack of medication suddenly gets faded away, and it becomes more part of the traditional mental health system.
So instead of lack of medication,
Yes.
it becomes medication compliance.
It's the funding. Soteria, I could have continued Soteria. I had the option to continue Soteria, and people ask me why did we close Soteria? Because in order to continue, the federal grants would end, and we would have to accept the Bates funding, which meant that we couldn't do what Soteria would normally do because we wouldn't have the funding. And the key person in the Santa Clara County where Soteria was Jim Manderberger. He was a really close friend of mine. He's one of the really supportive of Soteria. And he told me that if I wanted to Soteria, that I wouldn't have to worry about the funding. And then he and I talked about it and realized that there's no way Soteria could be Soteria and have that funding because it required certain kinds of things that would be contrary to the model. And so my problem was, I went to Lauren Mosher and went to David Rosenhan, who was my really close, we were part of a board, and he was my closest, not officially, but sort of way put it. And he and I taught a class at Stanford together, so we spent a lot of time together. And I talked to them about, especially with Lauren, if the Soteria closed, did he have enough data to support the model to time? And he and I and David and Jim Manderberg all agreed that it was better to close Soteria, and the research would speak for it forever.
Wow.
And to distort it, than have that kind of distortion where people could say, well, yeah, look what you're doing here, better than what you could do. Soteria actually did. And that's why I closed. That was my role to make the decision, and I made the decision to close it.
To keep the purity of it so that they couldn't take that name.
And Lauren had that so much power, because you have to realize Lauren was the chief of study of schizophrenia at the NIMH. There was like 200 publications in journals of Soteria. So it's not ever going to go away, because that's the power of Soteria. And the real other power is the clinical purity, how it did work, not the distortion that if we'd followed pharma, how they funded the money through counties and stuff, it would have distorted Soteria in a way that would not,
So this is just a kind of factual point of clarification. At some point, I read, I think, that Lauren was removed as director of the project and replaced by someone who did not believe in it as he did. How were you able to continue when the chief guy that was supporting it was removed?
At that point, I mean, when that happened, Soteria was, we had done all we were going to do. I mean, and Lauren doesn't have that. In terms of the operation of Soteria, Lauren is not a person that's that much involved with the clinical part itself. Lauren's power is the research. He is not only that he's just that in that position, he is the founding editor of Schizophrenia Bulletin that comes out of that. He was the chief editor the first 10 years. So his power is broader than just his title. And even though that 10 years, by that 10 years, that's at that point, Soteria, I mean, they were defunding Soteria already, and it had very little impact on the model itself. Like I said, the program itself could continue through other funding sources.
Okay.
But we
Okay.
decided not to in order to protect the pure, the sanctity, the purity of Soteria, the model itself.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so I find this word purity interesting. Cindi and I just had a conversation with somebody, and that came up, and the in many conversations with you and your talk for Rethinking Psychiatry, and you talked about how Soteria House evolved, like you figured it out on the fly, you created it kind of from the stuff of your being, and collaboratively, and yet it wasn't infinitely malleable. Like there were some things that made it Soteria, what you're saying, some things that made it Soteria that if they changed, it would no longer be Soteria. And I'm wondering if you all or Lauren ever came up with like fidelity criteria.
What is Soteria?
Fidelity criteria.
That was the basic thing, being with for doing two. It's
That's simple.
it's simple, and where that comes from, this is a really long discussion. We talk, people ask me how much did race impact Soteria. On the surface, it didn't look like it that much at all. You realize Soteria is in Santa Clara County. 3% of Santa Clara County is African American. In that part of it, it's more Hispanic. There's the larger population of Hispanic, but where the race does come in, my minor is African American Studies at the university. So the person who's most impactful in what happened in Soteria, not that like I was dictating anything, is that I'm getting advice from these people who these different cultures and stuff. And I think there's for instance, there's a word that's becoming popular. I noticed Ubuntu. I don't know if I said this before. It's how to describe it. It's a word, I think it's a Zulu word that implies it's a word that implies a lot of things but it's in a single word that no other language has. It's essentially to say, I am me because you are you. In other words,
Wow.
I am me not because I'm just saying, because how other people affect me and how I fit into. It's a we culture rather than I. We see ourselves as an I culture, and this Western culture, the Marlboro man. But some cultures are very different, and a lot of what my input is Soteria, I never talked about it in that language in terms of from my class. I talked to more broadly that Soteria, that's where the community becomes important. That it feeds back. We are Soteria, we are part, and we minimize language like I was going to mention that it was one of the other participants said, what is the term he used? It's a psychiatric term he used that implying that
treatment, no.
Yeah, something to do with treatment. I think it's how do we
What, Cindi?
Pardon?
Go ahead. It's not what you were thinking.
Yeah, it was something about oh God, why am I blocking the thing with he said? But it's essentially about how do you deconstruct, someone who's been treated at mentally ill, the stigma. How do you get rid of that somehow? And the whole point of satire is to never make someone see themselves as damaged. Recovery, I think if there is no recovery, satire doesn't make any sense, because there was nothing wrong with you to begin with. And that's why satire dealt with, the model of the study was dealing with people with the first break. Because if everybody in this country suddenly went through a satire before, 90% of them would never wound up in the system. That was the point. So we even like peer, we didn't use language like that. Didn't make sense in satire, because it was nothing unnormal about people. We didn't.
Right.
That was the whole point. And part of that comes from African tradition. A lot of the stuff that's coming in satire, in some ways, has a lot to do with a broader culture than the tradition, what we think is traditional Western culture. So there's a lot about satire that is much broader than Western culture, the Western culture that we think about. It just doesn't show up in terms of number of people being impacted. That's if you just walked the sea, you didn't see a lot of Black people in satire. You saw you saw more than the percentage that was in the county.
I wondered if because that's not, specifically addressed, and I just wondered if there were a diversity of races, especially including Black there. So there was a diverse representation in the home.
Yeah, and the other thing, you think, because I've dealt with this a lot. My Blackness at satire, how did that affect it? It affected me in very different ways. Sometimes there's could be some negative, but there was actually some very positive. A lot of people who had never experienced that, that you come to me and they're willing to talk to me about things that they wouldn't have talked to someone who it's just like, they're talking to somebody strange to them. They can be more open than not.
You're talking about white people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And being aware of that, you can use it in ways that a lot of times I say, well, how come they'll go, with the staff, how come somebody like doesn't talk to you, tell you all that? Don't tell me that. Because I'm not a threat in that way. If you look at my sister or brother, there's sometimes that can be a threat, because I'm exposing something I don't want to expose. But if it's just something neutral, I can expose it, and it's not a threat. Being aware of that kind of stuff, it sometimes can be powerful.
Do you want to say your question from the beginning?
Okay, so I wanted to comment on where you were talking about how the core of the essence of soteria was really very much part of what the African village connection and way of being was naturally, if I understood you correctly. Is that correct?
It's just so, about being with, it's a combination of several different things, but one big powerful thing was that Ubuntu, that concept of understanding, that we are we because we interact, we create ourselves. That other than that, we're no different than a rock. It's just that we create ourselves, and that's.
And that's in relationship. That creation happens in relationship. Yeah. So when we talk about co-opting and changing, it's very interesting, because in the Washington State Hospital, now Western State, where my son is, because they've been decertified and defunded by Medicare, decertified from the Joint Commission, they're not, they weren't able to keep staff from the beginning because they were so horribly it was dangerous for staff and patients, right? But now with no decertification and deep funding, they've had to seek folks that will be willing to come there that are not jeopardizing so much their license. So my daughter recently found out that over 300 of the staff at the hospital now are from Africa.
That is a very powerful thing. How different 1971 is from 2021. There's a different world, and we have a tendency to see African Americans or Black people as some kind of one thing. We're not. They're so diverse. We're so diverse a group of people that it's doesn't make any sense. The difference between two African Americans could be dramatically different, and so it's the way we talk about race is kind of doesn't make any sense in reality anyway, because race is biologically doesn't make any sense at all. Culturally, it's a very powerful thing, and but how do you make sense of that in terms of Soteria or any other model of thing? How do you incorporate that into that process? And the whole thing, what you talk about, training people to do Soteria model, it's almost an oxymoron. It's experience that made people effective at Soteria, not training. It was my job was to, and the staff of hiring people who made sense at Soteria. I didn't go out looking for, someone who had this skill and that skill. It's complicated. Because if you're not talking about this process not being a disease, that means something very different. A disease implies you got to fix it, you got to get rid of the disease, you got to do something. But you're talking about a state of, this is one state of normalcy. It's very different, means something very different.
One state of normalcy, that is like, it's not like they're at the extreme of the continuum of normal, but this is a state of normalcy.
I thought about this over and over. As Lauren says, I was the person had been with more people who diagnosed schizophrenic, but not ever been on medication than anyone else in this country at that point. I don't know if it's changed by then. Most of my experience with people who the diagnosis who would call mentally ill weren't on medication. So where I see people who would be like that very different. There's a normalcy about it. It's not a disease, it's a state. And you think about it, if you think about Soteria, 90% of Soteria people were between that age of 16, 17 to 25. So you look at these people, and most of these people at Soteria for that time, at Soteria, only 8% of them were on medications. So when I see people who did at Soteria, it's not there's most of the time, except for the week or two, maybe some months or so, with that Soteria, having what we call delusional, those things we talk about, tended to just went away. Even though they came in, they were considered very severe. They weren't.
Yeah, I was telling somebody that you actually were looking for the people who had the worst prognoses.
That was part of the whole design of the thing, was the people at that point, the statistics would say certain kinds of things mean that you're probably going to become chronic in the system, and that's who they were looking for. And they treated the same people in the hospital, etc. So they were the same population. So they,
So
what do you say about those that have been chemicalized, medicalized, and traumatized size. I mean, you'd say, okay, before that state, that's just a stage of normalcy, but 20 years later.
That's not true of people who we call chronic schizophrenic. They are damaged, but they're not damaged from the original condition of being delusional. They're damaged because of the way they've been treated. Being on medication for 10 years does make your brain different. Having gone through what they call delusion does nothing to your brain. You tend to go out. Then if you look at this, if you look at the Bern study, Lou Ciampi study in Bern, Switzerland, and the Vermont study that Courtney Hardy. Courtney Hardy, pardon?
Were you talking about the Vermont longitudinal study?
Yeah, the Vermont study was, and the original study was done Bern, Switzerland by Luc Ciampi, a psychiatrist. And what they found that if you looked at people, we need to also just looked at people, 2 to 5 years and 6 years, and it looks terrible. Look at people like,
if you're not medicating people.
Yeah, they're going to be damaged for the rest of their life. But if you look at people 20 years plus, they almost look like the normal population. And almost none of them are on medication. Both studies are exactly the same thing. What happens? How come these people suddenly at 20 years, they look like the normal population. They stop taking their medication and all those symptoms all go away.
Over time, you're saying.
Something about the disease model doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It's not logical. If you look at go ahead.
I just want to say something about there's a lot of research about the neuroplasticity of brains and how brains heal. And so even long-term on medication, people's brains can recover, but it can take time. And
yeah, but when you say recover from what?
From the medications. Yeah, from the medications.
Because the clear study that came out that the early 2000 that showed that the longer you've been diagnosed and the more brain loss you have lost.
That was Andreassen's
study. And the implication was that schizophrenia caused brain to atrophy. But what they don't show you is that the longer you study, the longer you're on medication.
Right.
Well, she did, to her credit, somebody pointed out, like, did you control for medication? And when she went back and ran the study, she did find that people who were unmedicated had no difference.
That's because the reaction of people like me and other people that went to her to say that that's what's going on. It's not schizophrenia. Bern, Switzerland, they did a couple of people who had been at the Satyria in Bern, Switzerland, who had been 10 years and never been on any medication, but had symptoms and stuff like that. They did his brain, he looked normal.
Wow, they actually did brain scans in Bern.
They looked at it, yeah. I don't know if they did it as part of the study, but this is according to Lou Ciampi, the guy that did the study. I was talking to him in Washington back when Lauren, he said that there was no brain loss, there was no damage at all, because he had never been on medication.
But Voyce, how is it that, I mean, because those people in that study didn't have a soteria. So you're saying that just being left alone?
All the people at their onset, those people that they onset never been on medication, they probably wouldn't have the brain loss. It's the point is more clear. The brain loss is caused by the chemical thing, not because of schizophrenia, because of the.
Yes, but my question is then, like what about the folks who kept Grandpa Joe at home, but he never did recover? And it's like these people in the Harding study, they didn't have soteria houses. They just were out in the community. How is that? How is that? I mean, I hear you saying the brain over time.
I mean,
just,
a lot of people, we assume that, but if, I worked in state hospitals way before soteria, with people, and that a lot of people that back in there got admitted to hospital and got discharged and disappeared and never seen anything else. Only a few people that actually want to stay in the hospital. Some of them stay for 40 years. We have no real evidence, clinical evidence of anything rationally about that. We don't understand at all. The problem I have, we don't understand. You ask a psychiatrist, what is mind? We have no understanding of this stuff. We treating things that we don't really know at all. We don't understand. We don't understand what consciousness is.
Voice is, so let me try to speak to Cindy's question and you tell me if I'm totally off or if I'm understanding it maybe. Would that be okay?
Don't give me too much power.
What?
Don't give me too much power. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you do have 50 years in the field,
Yeah.
and created this amazing program. So you get some credibility here. If that the understanding is that psychosis and schizophrenia aren't diseases, but natural attempts for our beings to make sense out of something that is unable to understand in consensus reality, then I wonder if the people in the Vermont longitudinal study where the hospital was shut down way back in, what was it, the 70s?
Yeah, it was actually, it started in the 60s, but yes. Yeah.
And so for people listening who don't know, it was that when the state hospital, when there was the deinstitutionalization thing, people were just like turned out, and it was also the 80s. Reagan had promised all the community funding and then pushed people out of the hospitals and then never funded community services. And people, they tried to keep clinicians tried to keep tabs of people, tried to get them to come into outpatient and stay on their meds. But some people just were like, I'm out of here. And so what you were saying was after 2 years, maybe they were, or like in the beginning, after half a year or a year, they were doing worse than the people staying on medication. By 2 years, it was about the same. But by 5 years, people who stopped taking the meds were doing way better, actually. And so if we understand this process as being maybe even, like you said, well, psychosis maybe doesn't do anything to the brain. Well, maybe it's actually a healing process. I mean, like not trying to
I'm just saying
romanticize it, but
I don't think we understand either. A lot of the data, what with the research and stuff, are skewed. It's hard to understand it at all. I don't know if you remember Robert Bola.
Robert who?
Robert Bola, they did this study at University of Southern California. Every study that he went back to look at all the studies that compared medication use with non-medication use. 100% of the non-medication use had better outcome than the medication use.
Wait, 100% of the, said that again?
100% of the people not treated with medication had better outcome in terms of study than the treatment model, not individuals, had better outcomes than the medications one.
Treatment models that didn't use
Yeah.
medication had better outcomes than
Yes.
treatments that were medication focused.
And I was a part, I participated in two of those studies, two of the major studies. The one at Soteria is probably the biggest study. The second biggest study is called the Rapaport Study.
That I have heard of.
Yeah, was done at Agnes State Hospital. I was a part of that too. I was not on the unit, but I was the person at admission that the people came to find out who would fit in their program. So I was the one that interacted back and forth. That's where Soteria comes from. Actually, that study. Lauren was involved with that study, funding that study, and he decided to do his program. It originally was going to be done at the hospital, but we wound up doing it in the community. So the point is,
so Voyce, would you say that if we had first-time psychosis now between that age, but the same now, like brainwashing in the community of how to look at someone with a psychosis, do you think they still would recover? Because I'm thinking that back then, and I even saw a video once where people used to have an idea, a schizophrenia or mental illness is one thing, but after the marketing to get folks ready to see it as a brain disease, people's whole idea about it has changed. So I'm wondering, if we're talking about recovering in the community, is it logical to say that the community itself now may not be as much a healing factor, even if we quit the drugging at this point?
Wow.
the community, it's healing. That's my point. There is no healing because having delusions and stuff is not an illness to begin with. Most people, if they're in a healthy, secure environment, that process happens, tends to just go away anyway. It just, the person adapts to themselves. It's the therapists always think of themselves as treating somebody, is doing something. It's not. The person themselves, in that context of a supportive community, does what it needs to do to make adjustments to that.
But you're not.
Some people make adjustments by using drugs. Some people adjust it by doing crimes. Some people do adjustments by all kinds of ways. We have this concept of, we have this paradigm that schizophrenia is some kind of disease. It's like there's a schizococcus, Lauren and I used to call it. The people who immediately have some kind of bug in it, like a thug that we have to get rid of. In reality, there is no bug. The people are making adjustments. And part of the way you make adjustment, I have a whole theory about why people become delusional, what that delusion process is. And being around people, so many people that are delusional, it makes sense to me. The people, I call it dreaming while awake. Almost 100% of the people, I brought everybody to Soteria. I went to the hospital and brought them to Soteria. This is at their acute state.
Right.
Almost 100% of the people within that week had not, especially the last 2 days, they had not slept. They were always, I think that what happens, and when that happens with people, I think we dream, even though we're awake. There's some part of dreaming that's real, that we do for some reason. And if you don't sleep,
wow,
the dream happens when you're awake, and you see that it does someone talking to you, that doesn't make you'll say crazy things, and that doesn't make any sense. And if you think about it, Soteria, we're walking around with people talking about being God or whatever, that doesn't make any sense. And, you know, and Soteria's model say, I'm like, I don't question what you experience. I'll disagree with, I don't see what you experience, but I can't see that what you're saying is not right. And if you think about philosophy as in real science, away from this whole topic at all, I don't think human consciousness thus represents reality in any real sense necessarily. It does, and there's a lot of neurologists now who agree with me. There's a really interesting book that's called Who's in Charge? There's a lot of things that we think about as being real, that the assumption is that not true. Your mind does everything that, for instance, your mind, everything that you hear, see right now that's going on, only about a little sliver of it that you are conscious of. But it in your mind does store it. And that information can come out, even though you don't have any control of it. You walk down the street, you see some person, you say immediately, I don't like it. I don't like it. There's someone like that person that disturbed me. Why? It's you just see them, and it's your mind doing things, and maybe it associated with something else. But reality is not a simple thing. So when we say someone is delusional, what does that mean? I could say what I experience is delusional because it's not necessarily real. Not in the sense that we think we agree about things, but it's not necessarily that simple. And if you're around people who are delusional and stuff, really psychotic, after a while, that gets a little tricky. And I've been around so many people who are very delusional and seen them, you know, they're not delusional. And I've seen people extremely delusional and suddenly sleep for 8 hours and wake up and totally be rational. It's just totally rational for
But
half.
like how dreams have meaning,
Yeah,
deep meaning, and are places where
you say meaning what? What does that mean?
well, like oftentimes I'll work with people and they come in with a dream that was really upsetting, a nightmare or a recurring dream. And as we explore it, not rationally, but as we go into the process and allow the dream to speak for itself, it's kind of like a gestalt process. It always turns out that they're working out something in their life that was painful or hard or scary or they can't figure out, and it's always trying to help them. The big bad scary monster is usually trying to protect them somehow or something. And
Yeah.
so
that's your interpretation of it.
Not my interpretation. I don't interpret dreams. I don't do that. I don't put things on people. I help people explore for themselves, and their dreams talk to them. When we get rid of the thinking mind and we go into a more kind of altered state, they get the elements in the dream to speak for themselves, and this is what, and they'll come up with something.
But that can happen when you're awake. You're delusional.
Yes, that's what I'm.
It doesn't make a difference. But how do you deal with that in reality? In that, the problem when you sleep, that can go away. The delusional part can go away just like that. I've seen it. A person sleep 8 hours and said you woke up and they look at you like, why you treat me like you treat me? And it's like there's that the delusional thing is gone, and it usually only lasts for like a half hour, an hour, and suddenly they're delusional again.
Wait, say that last thing again.
So that togetherness can usually doesn't last very long, and they're back. The delusions become back, and they're hallucinating and they're doing things again. But what is that? Why all of a sudden it's gone? Well, the point is, I'm not saying I understand. I'm saying I had no clue why they're doing what they're doing. My point is that as another person, I cannot experience your experience. what you're going through is what you're going through, and that change happens. I can't make you not delusional. There's no way I can do that. I can be a prop in your something that you interact with. That's why the community becomes so important, that they can choose what they need at any given point, at any person, to get through that. That's why I was freaked out when Susan at the Superior in Alaska. I met her and she said she was working with two people, and she hadn't hired any staff yet. This is with Alma. Those told me stuff. It was distorted. It wasn't the truth. But in my head, okay, how you could be doing Soteria by yourself?
But she wasn't.
Yeah, I know she wasn't, but I didn't know that. See, I was listening. Alma was telling me, so, and that doesn't make any sense, because in a couple of days she'd be burned out. I mean, it doesn't make. There's no way that happens. And my point is that where they talk about the making the changes that a person needs in the context, is that person in that context. It's the context, the people, that gives the material for people to get what they need. It's not, I can contribute to it, but I can't fix you. There's no, I can be.
So that's why I was saying the piece about doing dream work, that if there's ways to work with dreams and find that they actually are trying to make meaning and understanding of difficult things in lives, then waking dreams also. And
that may be true, but I don't know. I'm saying, when you're working with a client, you're working. Like I say, for schizophrenia, I don't think a therapist that kind of model works that way. But when you work with your clients, that's a different thing. That's a whole different process.
I've only worked in my practice. I've worked with people who had spent significant time in altered states, but now they're working with me, and they're no longer.
We're talking about two different worlds.
I know, but I'm just clarifying what I'm saying. It's interesting that now we're able to go back and explore those altered states that were terrifying to them.
Yeah.
And realize that there was meaning, that there was really important, rich meaning in them. But I understand that's different than what Soteria House does.
Altered states has powerful meanings. There's no argument with that. That's what I'm saying. But the person who's going to make the change is the person themselves.
Yes.
And the important thing is providing the context in which that happened. If I'm in the context and I'm the therapist, I'm telling you, I know more than you do about yourself, and I'm telling you how to fix yourself. That's not going to do anything. They're going to turn you off, because it's not logical for them. It doesn't make any sense. So it's just like, it's illogical. So it doesn't work. So the being with, the whole concept of being with, is providing the safe context.
Voyce, it's interesting that actually, I guess you could call the way that we explore, when I'm working with somebody who's no longer in this altered state, but they're tortured by it still. They're still like, oh, that time in my life, that was so terrifying. And as we explore, I've never thought of it this way, but what I'm kind of doing is coaching them into learning how to be with their altered state experience.
Yeah.
So that, instead of being afraid of it and trying to control it or trying to make it go away, it's like, can we turn towards it? Can we say hello to it? Can we? And so that's interesting.
So looking at me, Soteria is done through the umbrella organization is the MRI, which is the God place for therapists, for it's family therapy. That's where it begins at the MRI in Palo Alto. It's the main. It's where Mnuchin, who these are the Virginia for Satir, these the big gods of family therapy. That's where it comes from, and that's I mean, when I go to MRI, that's who I'm involved with. I constantly getting their feedback about Satir and how weird they don't realize, they think if I was there, I could talk someone out of, it's the fact that we're talking about two different things. What you do is powerful for that in that context. But so in Sateria, for the people, staff in Sateria, they can't function that way.
No.
Make any sense. Yeah, that's it was like, that's what I said. We're talking. I don't want to make sure that realize we're talking about different things.
Yes. It's a very different experience, but it is interesting that I think coaching somebody how to be with their former self.
Yes.
And their experience.
You hit it on the head. You could, in what you're doing, being with can be very powerful too.
Yeah.
Understanding that. Yeah.
What were you saying the name of that institute was?
Mental Research Institute, MRI. It's known as the MRI. I mean, it's people you don't hear much about it now, but it's where system therapy got its biggest hold, where most of the research from family therapy, the early research in the 60s and stuff, it starts in 55, somewhere in that mid to late 50s, it opened, and it created that whole concept of system therapy, family therapy, and that stuff comes out of the MRI, actually. And that's what the reason Sateria was a part of it, because it was dying when Sateria opened. And Lauren, because it has such a powerful image, puts Sateria part of MRI, which gives it some kind of credibility. It was all Lauren's ideal of
politicking,
politicking and bringing something to the system. So a lot of my life is part of MRI. In fact, the last conference I did was with Virginia. You know who Virginia Satir is? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Jay Hay.
You want to just say, because maybe people listening won't know who she is.
She is one of the early therapists who actually her big studies that it's more powerful. She did studies with communities. She not. We think about family therapists working with families or individual therapists. She worked with communities.
So community psychology.
Yeah, and sometimes these,
so good.
We think of more primitive communities, which that was her work. And she was quite famous. And in fact, I talked to her just probably about 6 months before she died. That would have been in like 80. That last conference she attended was that conference. We put on this conference as part of MRI. Jay Haley is another sort of big name. He wound up at University of Texas. And he's more of a traditional family therapist. Mnuchin, God, what is Mnuchin last name? First name? But he's more famous for the inner city approach in New York. That's where his fame comes. There's Whitaker. I think it's Jack. Oh God, Paul Whitaker. I think his name is University of Wisconsin, but more in the university context, the educational context. Who had been another Watzlawick, Dick Fish is another. The brief therapy was a group that came out of the MRI. It was a famous. That was happening when I was there, and I used to participate in that. These were people, they would take a person in, and they would see him only maybe 2 times, 2 or 3 times, and they would have one therapist with the person in the room, and they had this one-way glass, and they had other therapists outside with communicating with the therapist in the room and giving him. It was kind of, I'm not supporting all of it. This is the kind of thing that was going on, and that it bloomed and became a sort of, because it saved a lot of money. And there was a guy, John Bell, who did normal families, which is strange. He had this whole group of families that he did therapy for them, and these families weren't people who had diagnosable, just any, but they were having kind of family conflicts, and he studied them for 20 years and did a lot of research. This is the stuff that went on at MRI, and before NAMI, that's where a lot of psychology money was going on. The research was pretty much on family research, was probably the biggest pocket of research that was going on. When NAMI comes in, they almost kill family research. I don't know if you realize, they almost end family research. They ended most of the money stuff because they saw it as family research, as defining family as the problem with people being schizophrenic. It's so one of their thing was the pressure that they get rid of the money funding this research. So MRI's money just dried it real quick. A lot of their money did, except Soteria there's so much money from Soteria that it kept them going. That was the big deal. So that was the last conference for them, was bringing these people all together for the last time. And, but that's a whole different model. So I was in between this group of people and the Soteria, all the turned Soteria study. It was kind of mind-boggling. I go to MRI, my office in MRI, then go back to Soteria.
Be like, whew, I'm glad to be home.
I mean, not only that they were doing Soteria, but these people who the people who are left at MRI, all these other giants left. So the people who are left are the people hanging on. So their personalities were kind of strange. It was an experience.
As we all are.
Yeah.
Well, Cindi, are you starting to go? What's your
Yeah, I am. I gotta be on a plane tomorrow. Voice, this is just a short one, or you could say save it for later. But I understand that it's normal. It's like having maybe not even as normal as having a fever, but that someone likened it to that one time. It's like just a fever, and the body uses it to do what it needs to do. But like, there was a community somewhere in Europe that actually was an open community to folks that other places might label as quote mentally ill. Pardon?
You talk about Kingsley Hall?
No, it was actual community.
was it Geel?
Okay.
Geel in Belgium?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you know that one? I'm sure you do.
I don't know a lot about it. I just know of it. I know a lot about Kingsley Hall, but that community is
right. But this was actually a community, and I'm still trying to figure out, does the kind of level of consciousness of the community of accepting folks or not accepting, like when those folks back in the 60s and 70s were released out into the community, I don't think there was as much stigma. And so they could find more places and people to work through their stuff without being
the best
othered.
The best I think implication of what you're talking about is the WHO studies, the two WHO studies. Are you
The
familiar
World
with
Health
I
Organization.
am. Yeah, I am. I am.
those two
In
studies?
Nicaragua.
Where they looked at these
Yeah.
you know, depend, you know, first world, like I think we think of primitive cultures versus the modern cultures, and they
Right.
separated them out. And so if you look at the primitive cultures, they had better outcomes, and
Yes,
they had almost none of those communities had what we think of chronic schizophrenia at all.
Mhm.
If you think about what you're talking about, that that
Does make it.
that that explains. And the argument the farmer and psychiatrists say, well, those people they live with their families and on the culture different. So they did the second study was to separate out and found exactly the same thing. The only real difference was 61% of the modern countries use medication, 16% of the primitive countries use medication. The only real difference is the medication use.
To account for the difference of why people
Right.
in the
Yeah.
non-industrialized countries were doing so much better.
Primitive countries, people who had to want to. Sometimes they did a little different thing, but they worked in the community. They were
Yeah.
not separated out. They were, you know, they were just part of the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where the modern culture, they become separate, and they become treated, they become chronic and system. The other really important thing to understand, if you read Robert Whitaker's book, Academy of
Anatomy of an Epidemic.
yeah, right. See, that a book was powerful for me, because I was working at the state hospital before the period he's talking with the book, and I was working in the mission suite, so I knew intimately what was happening with that population. If a person came in the state hospital with what we call now suicidal, or the things that we put under that rubric of mood disorders, 90% of them were sent home after they saw the doctor and told to see a therapist. They almost never admitted. The only ones that were admitted were someone who was acutely suicidal, something like that the doctors were worried about. But other than that, they were sent home. That was before that was before Prozac and that whole shift. When Prozac come on, that whole population changed dramatically when they started getting medicated. The change. Now the profile between the prognosis between that group and schizophrenia is almost identical. It is the change, and it's correlated right even with the medication. And I could prove it, because I was at that point where people were being with what was being done with people, you know, who had the sick. At that point, it was DSM-2, so they didn't have the same diagnosis, but it was the same population.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's why for me, I do want to talk to Robert Whitaker, because he has a lot of his stuff really is pertinent to my career.
Wow.
That would be a really good point for him to add on the next edition of his book.
I was intimately involved in that process of moving people from state hospitals into the community. One of the biggest state hospitals in California, and one of the biggest cities in California, where the 9 counties of the Bay Area went to Agnew State Hospital, and that hospital was dumped into San Jose, essentially. And I was part of that movement of people. So I saw people suddenly
deinstitutionalized,
and how that changed, and all that process, how the money didn't follow them, and suddenly these people were essentially just put in the community. And but it's interesting, if the Harvard studies showed that from the 19 from 1900 that period through I guess it would be the 80s, 90s, that people were better off if they had the diagnosis back then, they knew it, than they were at the end of the study. You can see a line. The assumption is that we've gotten worse at treating people, not better, in the last 120 years.
You're saying it was a study that looked at outcomes from the early 1900s?
Yeah, the Harvard study went back. What they did is they went back to, I guess it was the year around the 19th century, right? It's I think it was called moral treatment, the moral treatment year model that was
the Quakers
treating people in their homes and stuff. They traced it, and they could go back because all the records are still there. They can go back and re-diagnose these people using DSM-4. So they were comparing apples with apples, and they showed definitively that you were better off being had that diagnosis then than you are now. The only exception was that short period between the late 60s and the early 70s. And what happened in the late 60s and early 70s? The state hospital closed. People were put in the community, and treatment people got better off. And there was no treatment. The treatment didn't follow. Just they were in the community, and they got better slightly. Then they went back down again because they started.
Well, so because there's the research that says, and this is what is that group? They say that when it went in the community and the hospitals were deinstitutionalized, that's when the jails became the hospitals. But you're saying that before that happened, there was a period where recovery.
It wasn't immediately. Immediately, they didn't want them in jail, but they got better. That's when the treatment started, and then they started treating people in jail. Someone went to jail, but they just went to jail for the jail. Then they put out. They weren't being treated in jail. It doesn't start that until it started getting the treatments. The county had treatment in the jail. That's when it started going down again. Just going to jail doesn't necessarily make it worse. Didn't make it worse because they were in there usually for a few days and they were out. It's when they started keeping them in jail and treating them. And then the mental health
isolation, 23 hours a day, right. And the drugs.
But even then, I mean, Stephen just when they were first out of the hospital, going to jail was relatively short, a few days. It wasn't. It just later on becomes people being treated in jail for long periods of time. Doesn't happen until 10, 15, 5 to 7 years later.
But I can't imagine even a few days in jail would be good for somebody if you're thinking that what helps. I mean, back to Cindy's question from a while ago of so if people are just kind of the natural course of people working through their stuff over time.
Good for you.
But if they're in something like Soteria House and they're in that relational, safe, relational, connected place with people, that can help the process go faster.
Yeah, it's totally different. But the jail, if you think about it, somewhere it's complicated. I think I talked a little bit about it. If you look at jail, especially if you go back to the mid 60s, and you think most Black people went to jail rather than to the state hospital.
Right. Yeah.
It was but that's complicated because in some ways, going to jail, if it was me, I'd prefer to go to the jail than go to the state hospital. You got treated better in the state hospital, but if you get, once you stayed in the hospital for, back then you could stay in the hospital for years actually, just going to there. But if you stayed that in for several months and you go back out in the community and you're walking that night and the police stop you and ask you a question, they say, you said you were in the state hospital. A lot of times they would take you right back. I'd be meeting people and they hadn't really done anything. But if you were in jail, you are dead. You'd be probably be in jail for a few days, and they wouldn't take you back to the hospital. So even though it's a terrible thing, it's complicated.
So interesting.
So
Complex,
Black people not being hospitalized, it was kind of, there's a mixed thing going on. All of it's terrible, but it's complicated.
You've read that book about Michigan State Hospital, and that psychiatrist went in and looked at the old records called Black Psychosis or something like that. And he actually, when in the 60s, schizophrenia went from being the kind of white disease for the whites that got institutionalized, or a few folks that were psychotic at Ionia State Hospital. And then after the uprisings in Detroit, because the Black leaders that they had imprisoned continued their leadership in prison, they began to be transferred to the Ionia Hospital, and they used the magazine commercials to show the shift. What was it called? Protest psychosis or something. Anyway, it went from the white person's, the women's disease, and he has the records, to now it's the dangerous disease, and the Black folks have it, and they got labeled, and that's how they were able to start the experimentation with the drugs on them, because they couldn't control them in the prisons.
I didn't read the book, but I could see it.
Yeah.
Surprising to me at all. We did a study in Santa Clara County. The San Jose Police Department, I think, by all definitions, was probably the best police department in the nation at the time. Wow. So it was a good thing. And the director of the police let us, this was after Soteria, but when I was working for the county, let us go in and look at how they were dealing with this thing. And we found it was clearly that if you're Black, you're more or less apt to be seen as going to jail, even if you have symptoms or not. If you're white, you are apt to be sent to treatment. It was fairly clear. We didn't go into all that much, but even in a very good police department, relatively speaking, the issue's there. And I can't imagine in bad police department with what's going on. But at least they were open and willing to let us, go in and do whatever we needed to do. And for Soteria, I could use the police department. And we treated a couple of their kids that they came to Soteria, and we did such a good job. They were really enthusiastic about Soteria. And so a couple of times we had a crisis at Soteria, and we had the police come and set out on the street in case we needed them, but we never did need them. But they would do that. And can you imagine that?
Can't imagine today doing that.
They would actually just sit there in case we needed them. That's what I said. They were a very good police department. I forget the chief of police name, but he was pretty famous nationally too.
Well, thank you,
Cindi. I just want to say that the protest diagnosis study,
psychosis, I think,
protest psychosis thing, that I kind of wonder if the white women's, schizophrenia being a white women's disease before that also might have had some political implications of husbands wanting to get rid of why, like, why
Oh,
is
it was
he-
clearly. I mean, it would be in the records that the husband had the wife committed because she didn't believe in his religion, or she wasn't getting the housework done, or I mean, it was very clear. It was that was the oppression of women, and that was the way, because you didn't want to have your wife in jail or in prison and have that kind of stigma.
Right, yeah.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah.
can see that too. Yeah, 'cause I mean, I used to keep up with all that stuff. In the last 20 years, I haven't been up on anything hardly, except for the more exotic stuff, neurology and all this other stuff. But back when Satira was in fact, that all the studies show that women there were more women diagnosed with schizophrenia, but men were hospitalized at a much higher rate than women.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was fairly dramatic, and it was to me it was very clear that it was more it was men thought more of a threat in the hospital. They were more concerned about it, that kind of stuff. But after that, because when Satira was on, we were then the American Psychological, the American Psychiatry, their annual meetings, we went to all of those things and presented Satira. So we were really up to snuff and on the research and all the stuff. So we know what was going on.
It was like willfully ignoring the evidence.
Of course, yeah, sometimes not ignoring, is manipulating the evidence and using it to get the.
Is his wife? Is his wife still alive?
Who's?
Lawrence?
Oh yeah, Judy. I haven't talked to her lately. Yeah, used to talk to her all the time, about the book. But her son took over the book, and I haven't heard anything about it. It's kind of a touchy thing. I don't know what's going on with his son. But yeah, Judy and I are good friends. So she's very much alive. Yeah.
What do you think? Because I get totally that soteria is the essence of the gift that you brought. I get that. And I also want to give Lauren, that kudos of being willing to be the head of schizophrenia and be willing to want to set up a challenge to it. So I was telling Grace that it might be nice if somewhere in there to invite her presence and give an
sort of avoid. She really had no involvement in the situation at all. So I know she sort of that's why even the book she didn't want to deal with. I don't know how.
Oh, okay.
Just mostly because of when she was doing the book I get checks from her and stuff like that. But she decided she didn't want to. She was backing out of it. I don't talk to her, but I don't. She doesn't. I think for her, she was involved with that the one in Washington, that study, Chamberlain study or something. Yeah.
Judy Chamberlain.
Huh?
Judy Chamberlain. Something.
Yeah, the Chamberlain, I think it was called. It was a very different kind of study. But she did. I mean, my impression of her, she just sort of doesn't want to be sort of that much.
But Cindi still might want to make a connection.
Yeah, I don't have a phone number. I never talked to her on the phone.
Maybe you could do an email kind of introduction.
Yeah, I guess I could. If I could find it, because I haven't had any contact with her at all.